There are three things that we must know. They are necessary for us to know so that we may live in comfort and die happily. And the first of these things is the greatness of our sin and misery. It's a basic essential to understanding the nature of reality. Everything. So where do we learn about sin? We learn about sin from the Bible, from the law of God. And not only that, but we confirm it with our experience. We see sin apparent in the law of God, and we know that the law is truthful because we can confirm that this sin exists in reality. Sin is the most easily verifiable substance on earth. And yet, this truth, this reality is challenged continually. So, the understanding of sin is out of the law. The law of God requires us, and Christ teaches this in Matthew 22, that you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Can you keep the law perfectly? No. But we are prone by nature to hate God and our neighbor. What does hate mean? Hate can range from indifference to outright hatred and anger. All of it is rebellion. Love of God and love of neighbor are connected, inseparable. The reason is, even though God is separate from creation, He created everything. Everything that exists is because of God. Now, God created us. We are in rebellion against God. But we can't show our hatred of God unless we do something about it. And that means harming our neighbor. Ultimately, according to Psalm 51, which David wrote, all sins are ultimately against God. When we are dead in our trespasses, when we are dead in our sins, that death that Adam and Eve brought upon everyone, we are rebelling against God. And since we can't physically harm God, what we do is physically harm our neighbor. And that includes emotional abuse, because that is physical, after all. So we are prone to hate God and our neighbor. Now when God regenerates us, and we are thankful for His salvation, and we begin to love God, how do we show that love? By loving our neighbor. Did God create man wicked and perverse? No. God created man good and in His own image, that is, in righteousness and true holiness, that he might rightly know God his Creator, heartily love him, and live with him in eternal blessedness to praise and glorify him. Then where does this depraved nature come from? From the fall and disobedience of our first parents, Adam and Eve, in paradise, whereby our nature became so corrupt that we were all conceived and born in sin. All of Adam's progeny are born in sin. If you look at Psalm 51:5, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. And if we go to Genesis 5:3, we see that it reads, when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. We are made in the fallen image of Adam. We are no longer made in the holy image of God. Now there are remnants of God in us, but we are made in the image of Adam. Are we so far depraved that we are wholly unable to do any good and are prone to all evil? Yes, unless we are born again by the Spirit of God. Now here's the big question that many ask. Does not God then wrong man by requiring of him in his law that which he cannot perform? Is God responsible for us being sinners? Since we are unable to keep the law because of sin, and God requires us to keep the law, is he guilty? No. God made man that he could perform it. But man, through the instigation of the devil, and by willful disobedience, deprived himself and all his posterity of this power. God will not suffer disobedience and apostasy to go unpunished, because he is terribly displeased with our inborn as well as actual sins. The inborn is that genetic problem that we inherit from Adam. And the actual sins are our own individual personal sins that come from that tainted soul that we have. And God will punish them in just judgment in time and eternity, as he has declared. Cursed is every one that continues not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Cursed is anyone who cannot fulfill the law. But then is God not also merciful? Isn't he also perfect mercy? Yes, he is indeed mercy. But he is likewise just. Perfect justice, perfect mercy. His justice requires that sin, which is committed against the most high majesty of God, to be punished with extreme, that is, with everlasting punishment, both body and soul. But he is also perfect mercy in that he has found a way for us to escape that judgment, and yet still the sin goes punished. But that's another issue. That was interacting with the Heidelberg Catechism. Now I want to look at what the Westminster Confession says. Our first parents, being seduced by the subtlety and temptation of Satan, sinned in eating the forbidden fruit. We know that from the story of Genesis. This their sin God was pleased, according to his wise and holy counsel, to permit, having purposed to order it in his own glory. There was no plan B. God knew this would happen. God gave us free will. Free will, because he knew that this would happen. He knew that we would choose against God. But it pleased him because the rescue from sin is more glorious than anything possible in this universe. By this sin, they fell from their original righteousness and communion with God, and so became dead in sin. When you think of sin being genetically passed down, original sin, think of it as death. Think of it as the genetic part that is passed down is stillbornness, is us being spiritually dead from conception. So they became dead in sin and wholly defiled in all the parts and faculties of soul and body. They, being the root of all mankind, the guilt of this sin was imputed, transferred to all progeny, and the same death in sin and corrupted nature conveyed to all their posterity, descending from them by ordinary generation. From this original corruption, whereby we are utterly indisposed, disabled, and made opposite to all good, and wholly inclined to all evil, do proceed all actual transgressions. We are inclined to evil. That does not mean that we're all serial killers. But it means that we choose self over God, sometimes to the point of denying God's existence, sometimes to the point where all that matters is self. That is the inclination, and then from that proceeds actual transgressions. How do I satisfy myself? And that usually ends up in harming neighbor. This corruption of nature during this life does remain in those that are regenerated. So even when God regenerates you, the corruption of nature is still there. And although it is through Christ pardoned and mortified, yet both it and all the motions of it are truly and properly sin. The regenerate believer in this temporal plane still sins. Every sin, both original and actual, being a transgression of the righteous law of God and contrary to his law, does in its own nature bring guilt upon the sinner, not upon God, whereby he is bound over to the wrath of God, the curse of the law, and so made subject to death with all the miseries spiritual, temporal, and eternal. Now, I'm not talking about redemption, I'm talking about sin. But with sin, we need to probably talk about free will. Because sin would not be possible if it weren't for free will. We have three options. 1, free will is in all of God's human creatures, all mankind. Sin is in all mankind today. Adam was created without sin. No sin. Adam was given free will along with the ability to choose sin. God knew he would choose sin, the devil tempted Adam to choose sin. Sin is enmity against God and promotion of self, putting oneself on the throne. That's essentially all it is. After Adam transgressed, he died. This spiritual death is transferred genetically to all of Adam's progeny. Sin dominates in all of Adam's progeny. We have free will still, but because sin dominates, we are in bondage to sin. We have limited free will. We are only able to choose between evils. We are not able to choose good. And by good I mean God, because God is the source of all goodness. We do not choose God. Our free will is in bondage. The third option is when sin is destroyed. We still have free will, but we only choose God. We're not in bondage anymore, but being in the presence of God eternally, choosing sin will never come to mind. That is only possible after physical death. When you are dead to all sin, the remnants that are in you, and you are now in the afterlife with God in heaven. So here is what the Catechism says about free will. God has endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to good or evil. We can choose. Man, in his state of innocency, had freedom and power to will and to do that which was good and well-pleasing to God, but yet mutably, so that he might fall from it. Man, by his fall into a state of sin, has wholly lost all ability of will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation. So as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. When God converts a sinner, he translates him into the state of grace. He frees him from his natural bondage under sin, and by his grace alone enables him freely to will and to do that which is spiritually good, yet so, as that by reason of his remaining corruption he does not perfectly, nor only, will that which is good, but does also will that which is evil. So, a converted man on earth can now do good because his will is no longer in bondage to sin, but he is still able to commit sin. When Adam committed sin, he became a slave to sin. When Christ frees us from that slavery, we are still able to commit sin, but we are also able to commit good. When we die and are dead to sin forever, we are glorified, and with Christ, we are unable to choose evil. Not because God, well, I don't know for sure. It may be because God restrains us, but I think it's because we are so in the presence of God that we do not desire to sin. We do not even think about sinning. I do not think it's a restraint. I think it's a purity. The will of man is made perfectly and immutably free to good alone in the state of glory only. Here are some words of John Calvin on free will and sin. Here's about free will. Scripture often asserts that man is the slave of sin. What it means is that his mind is so far removed from God's righteousness that he thinks of, deeply desires, and undertakes nothing that is not evil, perverse, iniquitous, and sullied. For the heart, having drunk its fill of sin's venom, can emit nothing but sin's fruits. However, we must not think that there is some violent necessity driving man to sin. He sins with the full agreement of his own will, and he does it eagerly and in line with his own inclinations. The corruption of his heart means that man has a very strong and continuing hatred of the whole of God's righteousness.